Hey y'all, so today we are going to take a look at how the North Carolina colony uh, began to form after the Lord Proprietors sort of get this land grant and begin to start trying to settle what would be known as the Carolina colony. So we're specifically going to focus on the Albemarle region, which is in what we now think of as Northeast North Carolina, sort of near the Virginia border, the area that sort of surrounds the Albemarle Sound. So, first, we are going to take a look at how the government of the Carolina colony was sort of established and set up, because this plays sort of a really big role in sort of how the Carolina colony ends up developing. So here we have the colony of North Carolina didn't just include what we think of as the state of North Carolina today. It includes all of South Carolina. It includes Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. And it's important to note that this land grant extends all the way across what we now think of as the United States, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So this is a huge grant of land. But what we're going to see is that the Lord Proprietors are sort of only focusing on settling what we now think of as North and South Carolina. So, one really important fact that we should know is that from the very beginning, from 1663, the Carolina colony had two very different regions. We think of them as the northern and southern region today, and we can also sort of think of them in terms of states. The northern region is what would become North Carolina, and the southern region is what would become South Carolina. So, from the very beginning, these two regions in the same Carolina colony developed very differently. They focused their economies on very different things. So you can almost say that maybe it was inevitable that the colony would split in two by the early 1700s. And so the first region that was sort of really started to be settled was the northern region. And this is the area around the Albemarle Sound, sort of near the Virginia border. In this area, there were very few colonizers. There are very few colonizers because this area is less suited for these large scale plantations that could grow cash crops. That's not to say that there weren't still farms and cash crops grown in the northern region, but we don't see those sort of large plantations focusing on a single cash crop in that northern region. The geography of the northern region made it really difficult to sort of get around. There were lots of forests and swamps that made travel difficult. The Great Dismal Swamp is sort of in this area, if you remember from our discussion of North Carolina geography. And so this Albemarle region, it's a mix of inlets and sounds and rivers. And so there are lots of different waterways, which makes it sort of a good spot to settle. But none of those waterways were sort of deep enough to establish big ports. Only small boats could sort of move in and out of this region. You couldn't have these big ships that sort of would make port or sort of uh, dock in order to trade. So even though they have lots of different waterways, none of them are sort of suitable to sort of establish a big sort of trade city. And so, because this area is sort of less accessible and less profitable, for a while, the Lord proprietors sort of neglect it. They sort of ignore it and they really focus on the southern region. And so that southern region sort of starts around what we think of now as modern day Charleston, South Carolina. And these are where sort of those first really successful settlements begin in the Carolina colony. Um, we see in the southern region that they copy that plantation style economy that had been successful in the West Indies. And so we start to see these large plantations that are growing cash crops like tobacco and rice and cotton. We see those sort of start to appear uh, in the southern region. And so, what's really important to note is that because there are these two distinct regions in the colony, for much of its early history, the Carolina colony sort of suffered from really weak government. Because the colony was so big, because there are sort of two distinct regions that are really far away from each other, it's really hard to govern and really hard to manage. And we're going to see that that becomes a really big problem. And so the Lord proprietors, when they get their grant from King Charles II, they are very ready to set up this colony quickly. The Carolina colony, we see that there had been failures at Roanoke. There were failures by Robert Heath to settle. Nothing seemed to sort of stick in the Carolina colony. And these Lord proprietors really wanted to make sure that they were setting this colony up as quickly as possible in order to make it successful. And so they had lots of different reasons for sort of encouraging colonization, setting up governments as quickly as they could, because these Lord proprietors, they wanted to make money off of this colony. And if you don't have an established government, if you don't have people sort of colonizing the land, you're not going to make money quickly. And so we're going to see that they're going to do everything in their power to try to establish that colony as quickly as they can. Another reason why they want to establish this colony is because Virginia, the colony of Virginia, still claimed control over the northern region of the Carolina colony, sort of around that Albemarle Sound. Even though the Lord proprietors had been given a charter that included that area, we see that Virginia sort of still claiming it as theirs. And so the sooner that the Lord proprietors could set up the colony, the safer that their claims would be from Virginia. They could sort of push back on Virginia and say, nope, this is ours. The people who live here follow our rules. We get to collect their taxes and sort of all of that. So the Lord proprietors are really trying to set up this colony as quickly as they can. Now, as we know from our founding of North Carolina lesson, we know that even before King Charles II grants these Lord Proprietors the Carolina colony, we know that there are some Virginians who move south away from Jamestown to settle this region in the 1650s. And so these people who had sort of colonized this area, um, who were not wealthy, like the Lord Proprietors, who were not sort of in charge, they and the Lord Proprietors, they're going to start to have very different opinions about how the colony should run and sort of how decisions should be made. And so, almost from the very beginning of the Carolina colony, we see the formation of political parties. Um, and we see that they are really split along those sort of economic lines. So, on one hand, you've got the Prerogative Party, and the Prerogative Party is sort of made up of those Lord Proprietors and their allies. We see that the governors of North Carolina will sort of align themselves with the Prerogative Party. Um, Men who owed their positions to the proprietors or the governor, they would sort of be, they would sort of swear their allegiance to this party. And the Prerogative Party really believed that a government independent of the people or without input from the people would serve the best interests of the colony. So, meaning people who were not sort of handpicked by the proprietors, they should not be involved in decision making in the colony at all. And on the other hand, we have the Popular Party. And this is sort of made up largely of men who had settled and colonized the Albemarle region before the Lord Proprietors were even there. So those Virginians who had sort of moved south from Jamestown. And so these two parties sort of sat on totally opposite sides because that Popular Party believed that they should be involved in the decision making. They might not have been appointed by a proprietor. They might not sort of have the wealth or the status that the Prerogative Party had, but they should still be involved in the sort of picking of representatives in government and in making decisions. And what we're going to see is this Popular Party is going to rebel sort of kind of almost every chance they get when they feel that the Lord Proprietors are making decisions that don't help them and their goals. And so the North Carolina colony, or the Carolina colony, I should say, when it was first established, we start to see the formation of counties or sort of different regions that begin to develop. So one of those regions is Albemarle County, sort of around that Albemarle Sound. This is the place that already sort of had colonizers from Virginia. And even though people would sort of move and join them, that county grew really, really slowly. It grew really slowly. And we'll take a look here in a second as to why it did that. We also have Clarendon County, and that is sort of near the Cape Fear River, sort of what we think of now as Wilmington, North Carolina. And the first colonizers in this county sort of abandoned their settlement and were eventually replaced by a group from Barbados in 1664. And this county sort of flourished for a while, but by 1667, it had sort of been abandoned again. We don't really sort of see anything come out of it for a while. And then finally, the third county that was sort of established at the beginning of the Carolina colony is Craven County. And this is in what we now think of as South Carolina, but it really wasn't settled or colonized until 1670. So we are going to take a little bit of a closer look at Albemarle County because this is where sort of colonization and settlement sort of really starts in what we now think of as North Carolina. Even though this area grows really slowly, this is sort of where everything starts. And so the colonial government of Albemarle County is sort of split into three parts. We see that there is an assembly, we see that there is a governor, and we see that there is a council. And this government is responsible for making decisions, enforcing laws, and we can almost think of it as maybe three branches of government, although they are not sort of separate from each other. So first, we've got an assembly, and this is made up of delegates or representatives that are elected. So they're picked by male landowning colonizers. And this assembly would sort of decide how the colony's money would be spent. So if you were not male, if you did not own land, if you were not white, then you could not vote. You could not vote for this assembly. The second part of this government is a governor. And this is a person who's appointed by the proprietors and sort of represents the proprietors' interests and sort of carry out their wishes. So this governor is not elected. It's important to note that this person held office as long as the proprietors wanted. So if somebody was doing a good job in the eyes of the proprietor, they could be governor for years and years and years and not be replaced. The governor had a lot of different powers that sort of impacted lots of different people. And it's also important to note that a law couldn't be passed without his approval. So the governor has so much power in the colony. And then finally, we have a council. And a council, they sort of make laws for the colony with the assembly and the governor. But the council also sort of acts as a court. It also acts as a court. So we can kind of see how it's similar to what we think of now as three branches of government with a assembly, a governor, and a council, or a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. So some of the features of the Albemarle region include inexpensive, good farmland. Remember from our discussion of North Carolina geography that this coastal plain region is the best farmland in the state. It's the best farmland in the state. And we're going to see that a lot of tobacco is grown in this region. There's also really great grazing land for livestock. There are great pine forests that not only give the community lumber, but it also gives them what are called naval stores. Now, if you have ever sort of touched a pine tree or sort of picked up a pine cone, you might have felt some sort of sticky sort of feeling things on a pine tree or a pine cone. And that pine sap is going to be sort of really important when it comes to shipbuilding. So, sort of that sap from pine trees, um, it can sort of be made into things like tar, pitch, turpentine, and rosin. And this stuff is really, really good at repairing ships. It sort of creates a waterproof seal. And so, because we have all these pine trees, this is a good source for those naval stores. And then we obviously see fishing. Again, there are lots of rivers and inlets. And even though they are too shallow for big ships and creating big port cities, there are still plenty of fish. And we also see fur trapping. And so, even though the region had really great farmland and all these other resources, accessibility prevented people from colonizing the Albemarle region. It's very difficult to get to. It's very difficult to get to. Um, and there's also another reason why people are not flocking to the Albemarle region. Those lord proprietors make it really hard to buy land. So there's plenty of land to the proprietors. We know that indigenous peoples are living on this land. But to the lord proprietors, there is plenty of land, but they're only sort of selling it or granting it to people in sort of small pieces. They aren't granting sort of these large pieces of land to people. They're sort of only giving people little plots of land that really only could be used as like small family farms. We also see, again, because the North Carolina government, as it's set up, is really weak, people don't really talk to each other. And so officials in the Carolina colony government, they keep really bad records and surveys of the land. So basically, sort of looking at how good the land is, sort of where there are hills, where it's flat, type of the soil. All of those records are really inaccurate. They're really inaccurate. So it makes it really hard to try and get people to um, sort of buy land when you really don't know what land you're buying. And then we also see that quadrants, or these real estate taxes, we can sort of think of them sort of similar to property taxes, the taxes you have to pay on the land that you own. They are so much more expensive than the ones in Virginia. And so all of these things are keeping people away from the Albemarle region. And so even though the proprietors are advertising the good soil and the good weather and everything else, the growth is still really slow because they are only giving these small plots of land out. Eventually, the proprietors sort of figure out maybe we should sort of change our land policy to try to encourage people to come. So they change their land policy so it's the same as Virginia, hoping that people who might move to Virginia would move to North Carolina. The assembly, so that sort of legislative body, they passed laws to try to encourage colonization, but nothing sort of seemed to attract enough new colonizers. And so here on our sort of early map of the North Carolina colony, we can see those first towns that begin to develop. We see that they are sort of north in this Albemarle region. We see Edenton and sort of Bath be established, sort of in this northern part of the state. And then as more and more people begin to move to the colony, we see other towns begin to pop up as you move south. So we see places like New Bern, which will become sort of the capital of North Carolina, the North Carolina colony. We see Wilmington eventually, but we are sort of moving north to south. We're moving north to south, sort of starting in that Albemarle region and moving south as the colony begins to develop and expand. So, thank you for watching. I'll see you all in class. Have a great rest of your day.